yeah, you carry talking with your notes and you start shouting.
I feel like it's been a long time, but also not a long time.
Oh yeah, I follow you on Instagram. Pretty active, so I feel like it's not been a long time.
Yeah.
You feel pretty present.
Close.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi guys.
I mean, Alice is not aware of anything because Alice is just giving a talk tonight. They don't know about the world building thing. So, I mean, you're more than welcome to come here. You might want to talk to Beth. So she's talking to, like, you can see her back from here. Exactly. Because she will be here tomorrow running the world building thing.
You should walk forward to you. So you want to speak to Beth, we can sort you out into a team if you want to.
So you are the developer of Horizon.
That's, yeah, start with that.
I'm going to talk to us through. So we launched it this afternoon. Just a presentation of the practical stuff that we have to do. And yeah, tomorrow we have a bunch of people coming tomorrow as well, like mentors, just to walk around. And then on Friday afternoon we're presenting we have them to do is lots of sport, lots of slips from between now until the present to 2030. We gave them some insights that they need to investigate. The whole point is like what happens when plastic gets scarce, how you regulate it, how does it changes. Yeah. So I mean, I'm actually, my introduction is literally, I'm trying to create a bridge between you.
Yeah. Okay. Interested to hear that.
Plasticity is quite good. I haven't spoken to them about plasticity. I think I've been very busy and literal with just plastic. But they had some conversation with some of the chiefs about plasticity. In any case, I'm making sort of like link and making between the way you use game to build well, but to create relationship with your games, or you build as well through relationships. And that's what I'm trying to do with building it. I mean, nothing to
No, the relational component. I talk quite a bit about the embodied plasticity is in there. I mean, I do kind of like I start with like a kind of nerdy thing about cooking, because it's like something I'm personally really interested in right now. But then it's more just about like model class, and this is something that breaks code and how it gets fucked up.
You're gonna give us some V-clip.
could do like a vibe coding book. No, but I think it all kind of makes sense. I mean, it's like it's new material, so I'm kind of just gonna like see how it goes.
Lucas, privileged. I might be sitting over there with Mike. Alice did that to me.
Start to see it, that's too bad. I'll see myself.
Just vomit to the comments. You know, an intro is going to be really good when the first line in my reading thing is my name.
Same. Just in case you forget. You know, it's handy.
Now we have the same methods.
Desperation is strong. After the room.
Just gonna still trying to figure out we keep it alive.
Let's turn him on.
How old? Okay. Well, if no one is chatting outside. Okay. Hello. Again. We're going to start. Yes, so I'm going to give a quick introduction. So I know that, you know, my name was on the bill for this lecture tonight. So just to avoid confusion, I'm just here to introduce and ask a couple of questions. The lecture is very much about Alice's work in relation to the digital innovation season. I have prepared an introduction, which I'm going to read to you. So for those of you, I'm fairly sure I know everyone here, but if you don't know me, my name is Sitraka Rakotoniaina. I'm a lecturer in MA Narrative Environments and MA Industrial Design. And I'm also the leading lecturer on the collaborative unit between MA Narrative Environments and MA Industrial Design. Which digital innovation season is actually support through its program this year, including Alice's talk. And talking about Alice, we're very privileged to have Alice Bucknell with us tonight. Alice is a Los Angeles-based artist and educator, and a few years back, actually, we were lucky enough to have them with us, tutoring on the MA Narrative Environment and supervising some of our second-year students as well. Second year's major project, and so it's a pleasure to have you back. And as I mentioned, this talk sits within the Digital Innovation Season Earthsuit Plastic Extinction, which is a prompt that asks what happens when plastic is no longer available, when it becomes scarce, regulated, or simply stops functioning as a default material for modern life. And plastic isn't just stuff. It's a material convenience that holds up whole systems. Because it's cheap, light, durable, and easy to mold, print. It's embedded in packaging and distribution, hygiene, and healthcare, electronics and energy, insulation and housing, day-to-day maintenance and repair, and so on. And often as the sort of hidden layer that makes things compatible, sealed, portable, disposable, and so on. So it shows up in the small bits: liners, gaskets, coating, cable insulation, sterile wraps, membrane. It's one of the reasons life may feel so frictionless sometimes. Things arrive intact, stay clean, stay dry, and can be used once and thrown away. So if plastic disappears, it's not only a question of substitution, but also a question of knock-on effects. Which habits collapse? Which infrastructures have to be redesigned? And what suddenly takes more time, labor, and care? That's when other skills and know-how become essential. Repair, reuse, ways of sterilizing, sealing, and working with alternative materials. And if replacements are scarce or expensive, then we also have to ask who gets to set the priorities, what gets protected, rationed, what counts as necessary. And earlier today, and the reason for inviting Alice as well today, we launched a world building exercise as our way into those questions. The point is to use world building as a method for ideation. Take one material constraint and follow it outwards into supply chains, maintenance, regulation, labor, environmental feedback, and eventually into everyday material culture. World building lets us think in relationships rather than object, not a single outcome, but multiple worlds produced by different technical choices, values, ideological projects, and power. Worlds produced by different ecologies, so to speak. And this brings me to our guest. Alice's work explores the affective dimensions of video games and interfaces for understanding complex systems, relationships, and forms of knowledge, straight out of your website. And the ecological dimensions of games that can dissolve binaries like humans versus environment, natural versus synthetic, intelligence, and self versus world. And across their project, Alice treats the game engine as a world-building tool, a way to stage constraints, dependencies, and feedback loops as lived experience. So the rules and shapes of the world become something you can move through and feel. What's especially interesting across the work is the range of world-building tactics Alice uses to make systems felt. You're not always asked to be a human protagonist. Instead, the game shifts the role you inhabit towards more than human or elemental viewpoints, a river, a wildfire, into collaboration between two very different beings, a bat and a flower, or into pairing as strange as a black hole and a lichen. So that you can perceive how you communicate and what you can do becomes the sorts of argument. Ecology, technology, and interdependence show up as lived constraints rather than themes. And what feels especially resonant for our brief, once again, how these worlds don't just represent technical and ecological change, they model relationships. That's the main thing I'm trying to get across here. They invite us to ask, what kinds of behaviors do our materials and technologies train? What kind of systems do they make normal? And what kinds of worlds become possible when a foundational synthetic material like plastic stops holding everything together? So please join me in welcoming Alice Bucknell and I've read your website. Real good.
Maybe I should just leave, actually. I feel like you nailed it. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the intro, and yeah, thanks to all of you for coming. This talk is pretty, like, it kind of goes through a few different eras, I guess you could say. We are going to be looking quite closely at some of my projects, like some of the ones Sitraka mentioned, like Nightcrawlers, the Alluvials, and Small Void, the video game. We're also going to be looking at kind of a bit behind the scenes in my process, because I think, there's so many things I could just take from what you just said now, but I think for me, like the kind of question of scale is a really, really big one. In thinking about video games as this kind of relational infrastructure or like relational technology, I think the ways in which you can scale from like the kind of embodied experience of the individual player all the way up to like the scale of a speculative environment or like a new political or social system that you're sort of carving out inside of like a fictional narrative inside of games. And I'm really interested in that multiscalar element. But I'm also really interested in the kind of like technological hardware, like the kind of gritty, like the mass effect of like the technology that goes into producing these virtual environments. And the kind of connection between video games, weirdly, and climate forecasting. Both gaming and climate simulation utilize game engines to sort of basically map and model the world. There's a lot of kind of embedded power structures in there, none the least with new advances in technology like world models, which we'll be talking about a bit today, which is AI-generated total 3D environments. So that's kind of the next step after video AI. It's like 3D AI, and we're already getting that with like character design that can be done, you know, in 20 seconds instead of like 20 weeks. Now it's just scaling up even more. It's like the scale of an entire world. So I'm really interested in these technologies and kind of the way my work functions, like both in the games, but more so in the film components, because I also make films as well, is kind of almost like a science and technology studies approach to some of these topics. So it's like, I'm interested in tracking the vectors of where these technologies, like climate simulators, like world models, where these are going, but also to kind of sneak through the back door some sort of poetics or like a sense of affect, a sense of embodiment, a sense of mystery that kind of punctures maybe this like seamlessness with what you're talking about, like the classic, the kind of smooth edge of a game world. So I guess that kind of actually also leads me into the third, and I've kind of done this backwards in terms of how I'm introducing it, but the third topic that we're going to be talking about today is this notion of clipping, which is where the title comes from in this talk. And I mean, clipping essentially is a kind of glitch or bug that often can happen in the game engine where essentially like two objects that aren't supposed to be in the same space at the same time are there together. And it creates this really messy kind of break in this idea of like a container or like a sort of containerization of like all these different elements in the game world being discrete actors that, you know, are fundamentally kind of separate from each other. And I've been really inspired by this notion of clipping. Like I love the kind of messiness and the glitchiness that does emerge with building games and building worlds. And I think like as we'll kind of work through some of my work today, you'll find like moments in there where, yeah, the kind of the breaking open of these complex systems like a game engine, or even like a story system, breaking it open and like the kind of bits of sharp glass and like other texture that is just coming out of this like snapping or breaking, for me is like a really interesting kind of sense of affect or like a sense of feeling, this kind of disorientation, you know, of like getting thrown out of the game world when something goes wrong. And I really like that kind of moment of like bewilderment or startling effects, and that definitely comes through in the world as well. So that's just kind of like a low-key rundown of how this is going. So yeah, as I mentioned, the title Clipped Horizon, it's pulling from quite a few narrative strings that I keep tugging at, both across the environmental sciences and game design. Both of these fields, although they sound very different, like they revolve ultimately around topics of modeling and simulation. And both of them are kind of haunted by this belief that more data equals better reality. You know, like you think about games, it's like this quest towards photorealism that the gaming industry has been on for the last, you know, couple decades, 3 decades, is kind of triggered and channeled by this belief that the more kind of photorealistic and like dynamic a world is, the more immersive it's going to be, the more it will capture people's attention. From an economic like market standpoint, the longer people will play, the more copies will sell, this kind of thing. And then likewise, the same goes with climate modeling. I mean, climate modeling is obsessed with this fantasy of like a perfect simulation of the planet. It's a whole genre of technologies that are called digital Earth twins. And these are basically real scale, real time digital doubles of the Earth that climate scientists are using to run incredibly complex modeling equations and basically try to predict how our climate will be changing anthropically, so at the hands of human behavior. Also, they're being used to kind of track extreme weather events like hurricanes or floods or tornadoes. Things that previously, seemed to kind of operate with a bit of mystique, like their own sort of rhyme or reason. Digital Earth technology is basically trying to predict and anticipate and reduce the severity of these weather events, which are also, largely caused by, or have been, their effects have been intensified by human activity. So yeah, between like both of these worlds, there is this kind of fantasy of like this perfect simulation or this perfect model. And I think one thing that I really think about a lot, like as an artist making work about ecology, making work about futures, making work with game engines, kind of the ways in which what can happen in a very sort of like Borgesian kind of way, where like the territory and the map get mistaken. And then if the territory like is sort of superimposed, or if the representation of a world is sort of eclipsed by the simulation itself, we start believing more in the simulation than we do like, touching grass and like being engaged in the world, like being a body. And this creates a really dangerous feedback loop where, basically whatever the model tells us is gonna happen, whether it's, we hit like 3 degrees or 5 degrees global heat temperature rise, by whatever date, like we kind of start adjusting our behavior accordingly, like according to what the model says. So in a way, it's almost like the model itself is, like the relationship between the model that's trying to represent the real has been sort of, the hierarchy's been flipped, and the model is actually more powerful than the real itself. And I think this is a really interesting kind of paradox, and it's tough to work through, because like these climate models are also like incredibly helpful in many ways. Like they do sort of reduce the amount of destruction and the amount of human lives lost to climate change, but at the same time, these models are also trained, like they're getting less useful just because they're, like the way the climate models work is they have to sort of train it on historical climate data. So basically how well a model can predict the future, ironically, is determined by how well it has predicted the past. And this creates a real problem because, the climate we live in now looks nothing like the climate that the data that it's been trained on. So more often than not, the more complex these models are getting, the less accurate they're actually becoming. So that's also a little, food for thought. But that kind of gives you like a slice, like a cross-section into some of the projects I'll be talking about, namely Earth Engine, and also Staring at the Sun. These are both projects that I made the last year or two that focus a lot on this paradox of predictive modeling, the ways in which prediction really forecloses like the realm of many, many, many possible futures into like a single most likely future. And the ways that gaming, the kind of awkwardness, the affect of it, the glitchiness, the sort of unbearable weirdness of being a simulated body in a simulated world, the ways in which that state can sort of trigger maybe a form of resistance against this idea of like, more data is always better, or more photoreal is always better. Kind of like what can be generated when the model itself sort of collapses or breaks is something that I'm thinking about a lot right now. So on that topic, the kind of first little bit of this talk is like a totally new rabbit hole that I've dug for myself. So thank you for indulging me with this. And I'm super curious to talk about it further together, and maybe you all have questions on it too. But I think, kind of framing my work in this new way, through this notion of clipping, through this notion of what can happen, what can be generated when the model breaks down, when the model fails, when the simulation bugs out and loses its vice grip on the real. And I would say, like, yeah, in the spirit of Earthsuits, I'm going to be thinking a lot about how this relationship is, or this kind of friction is necessarily kind of embodied as an experience. And also kind of thinking about how this friction can sort of emerge in the sort of worlds that you build here, during your time here, like as a student, but also in the sort of intensive that's being cooked up for you right now as we speak. So yeah, hopefully that'll be like an interesting kind of point to toggle on. And then in addition to the kind of embodied scale, the awkwardness, the glitchiness, the strangeness of falling through a map, of like having your virtual arm dislocate, like other crazy things happening as the clip bug emerges. We'll also be talking about the kind of scaling up to the scale of the planet. So we'll be looking a little bit at digital Earth twins, as I already mentioned, and this burgeoning field or burgeoning workflow, I guess you could say, in game design of world models. So we'll be looking at some of the kind of world models by Google. It's called Genie 3. We're just going to be taking a quick look at that and just kind of speculating on, in the interest of speculation, on like where this technology might go. And actually to kind of in a way, like enjoy the moments where it totally flops. Because the kind of infinite boredom of infinite worlds is also like a very real issue we're going to have, like this sort of like sickly smooth, like the smoothness of these generated worlds, like the kind of flatness of them is something to be aware of and be critical of. So yeah, that's kind of the structure. Okay. But first, before we talk about world models, I want to do like a quick drive-by of clipping and why I'm so obsessed with it right now. So maybe some of you have heard of clipping, maybe you also play games, maybe it's something that is agonizing for you and you're probably wondering why I'm geeking out over this thing. But yeah, clipping basically is a moment it's a bug in video games where two models that essentially should not occupy the same game space somehow accidentally do. And this is like a point where the logic of the game system, the game engine, starts breaking down. Physics starts acting really weird. Boundaries collapse. Objects pass through walls. Limbs dislocate. A void opens up in the ground. Players tumble out of bounds. And if you're lucky, the engine will be able to sort of figure out what's going on in between frames, and it'll be able to sort of reorient itself, and the bug will be no more. If it can't figure it out, it will just, the engine will just crash out, and it will take the whole world kind of down with it. So clipping's affective register is pretty variable. It can be funny sometimes, it can be frustrating sometimes. It can be occasionally exploitable if you're a really seasoned gamer and you know exactly how to run through walls. It can really, be a nice recipe for speedrunning. But the general vibe is dissociation. Like it's a very dissociative experience to experience the clip. And this is because what happens is there is this moment of puncture. There's this breakage of basically the believability narrative of the game, of the world, of the story, just breaks down. And players are temporarily kind of ejected from this like so-called like magic circle of the game. They kind of come back up to air, and sort of momentarily get kicked out of that playable character's body. The game, as a totalizing system, begins to cease its control over its audience temporarily. So for this reason, gaming industry hates clipping, like abhors it, like worst nightmare. But I think for artists and designers, this notion of clipping can offer a really productive friction against both like the logics of how we assume game worlds operate and the logics of separation that we assume exists between the playable character and the game world itself. Okay, so a little bit more fun facts about clipping. In the history of video games, clipping was not always a concern. As you probably know from like any arcade games you've played growing up or, retroactively at a bar these days, playing Pac-Man, Space Invaders, any other arcade classic, everything generally stays in its lane. And clipping really only became a problem in the 1990s with the arrival of 3D graphics. So essentially, this is the moment where games sort of turn their attention less away from maybe entertainment, you know, with the bare minimum kind of like 8-bit graphics, or sometimes just text, sometimes no graphics at all. And they're really gunning for real-world simulation, right? So the same Cartesian X, Y, Z grid that we inhabit, games start to kind of push for that too in the 1990s. And this was a really accelerated, like pretty whiplash-inducing moment of transition and change and evolution for games. You know, Haroon Farokhi has this really beautiful video essay called Parallel 1 to 4. He made it, I think like 10 years ago now, maybe more, maybe 15, like 2012 to 2014. And in this video essay, he's kind of tracking the history of the aesthetics of video games and sort of how this like move from, you know, the most basic 2D computer games to like the most hyper-real, you know, at that time in 2014, which I guess was like GTA. So anyways, he kind of makes this really interesting point where he's like he's embedding games in the history of art history itself. And he's looking at, you know, how long it took painters, sculptors, drawers, artists, to basically mimic reality, like how long it took humans to understand perspective, to understand scale through their creations. You know, this was a process that took thousands of years. In the history of computer games, this process took 3 decades. The amount of compression in this evolution is kind of hard to overstate, really. And yeah, I think that's like quite an interesting point that he made. But another thing that he doesn't really talk about so much is like, you know, games are not just spatial simulators, they're temporal simulators as well. So I mean, basically, you know, in a game, if you know, an apple falls from a tree, it should kind of fall at roughly the same speed that apples fall on Earth, right? Unless it's taking place on another planet. That's like a whole different story. But like a wave should break, a body should move, a car should be driven, a car should drive, maybe drive itself these days, exactly kind of as it does in reality. The kind of temporal loop has to be consistent with what we're used to. So this basically results in a really complex system, interactive system where countless collisions between objects are firing off constantly, and the game is trying to check them as best it can, frame by frame, to make sure nothing is colliding that shouldn't. And then sometimes it just misses, right? So that's what happens. That's like the anatomy of a clip, basically, or anatomy of clipping. Okay, and then one final piece of additional game design lore, just to kind of set the stage for going through my work, along with a beautiful, beautiful still from Death Stranding 2. Okay, so the overarching logic of games, yes, there are many typologies, there are many different types, types of games, but there's a kind of overarching logic that I think you could generally assign games into one of these two systems, which is player versus player, or player versus world. And these are terms that I'm pulling from MOGs, so multiplayer online games. But if we just kind of bypass the necessarily sort of adversarial nature of MOGs and think more broadly about these relationships between players and players and worlds, essentially, the general structure still tracks. Kind of in every game, you know, either the player is doing something to other players, or the player is doing something to the world. And the world is a kind of big carrier bag that is not just the landscape, but also NPCs, like language agents, like any kind of, you know, other being in this world. Kind of this notion that it kind of exists for the main player, the playable character, to kind of, you know, interact with to their pleasure. So what happens is really interesting with clipping is that this assumption that the player is necessarily always the protagonist, that the environment and its inhabitants are just simple set dressing. This hierarchy is temporarily imploded. Clipping kind of redistributes the agency away from the primacy, the hierarchy, the dominance, you could say, of like the main character, the main player, and kind of pushes it back into and on top of the landscape itself. So the world itself becomes like a kind of active agent, even if it was accidental. Yeah, so I would say that in my practice, and we're going to get there in just a sec, I promise, the broader ideology of clipping and the really chaotic state change that it triggers has really immense appeal for me. And these are ideas that have kind of come, in more like recent history of gaming, and specifically like a lot of indie games, like Flower. It's a game that was made in 2009. It's crazy to believe it's almost 20 years old already. In Flower does an amazing job of muddying and breaking apart this binary between player and world. In this game, you play as wind. So you're playing as, this non-human element of wind. And you can't really see yourself, of course, because wind is invisible. You can kind of see almost like a sort of shadow of yourself, as you sort of flow through the tall grass, and you start to kind of collide with flowers that are dotted all over the landscape. And as you collide with them, you're basically whipping up trails of petals that kind of follow you in your wake. So it's almost like a dragon, kind of fantastic. If you can kind of imagine this, like fantastical, like multicolored, like feathery tail that's kind of following you around and whipping around behind you. So I think it's a really beautiful game because, everyone who's ever had a dream about flying, that mechanic really hits. Like, it's always a banger. But I think what's really cool about this game is this notion of like a sort of extended sense of self. Like, the petals are not you, but they're also like not you either. Flower was like a pretty big inspiration for me for like a lot of the games I started working on the last few years with collaborators, including Nightcrawlers probably being the most obvious one, which is a pollination simulator, which was pretty directly influenced and shaped by Flower. Of course, bringing that component of this sort of hybridized body, the you but not you, bringing that to like a two-player game adds like a very exciting, for me, like dynamic that, maybe you get less of if it's like a single player. Cool. So, okay, now we're moving into my work. So thank you for tolerating the clipping lore. But I hope that like everything we just talked about is like a nice little like appetizer and maybe makes some of what I'm about to talk about in my practice like make more sense. My games, broadly they've been described as ecological games, and I think I generally vibe with that description. However, they're not trying to do what a lot of like so-called like environmental or green games are doing. Like, green gaming is like this whole genre of games that has like environmentalist or ecological themes. But I think a problem that I sort of take with this game typology of green gaming is that they kind of force this like fantasy, force the hand of this fantasy that the climate is a system that can be gamified, like that can be beat, that can be solved. And they also push that labor onto, more times than not, like one single individual. So it kind of has this like slightly unhealthy relationship to sustainability narratives and to kind of adjusting our behaviors with the planet, because it sort of closes down our own accountability in some way. And also, like, there's a lot of these games kind of push this sort of like hyper doomified narrative, which I think can also be more paralyzing, I think, than encouraging. Even though my games kind of nestle inside of some of ecological gaming or environmental gaming, I feel like I try to sort of push back against this idea of gamifying the climate, of it being sort of a quest or like a challenge that can be won or lost, like as if there's like a kind of as if it were so simple, you know. So I try to sort of push outside of that, and I think the ecological angle in my games is more coming, like, less from a place of like winning or losing, like typifying and maintaining and controlling the earth in that way, which is such a kind of, yeah, dangerous like mode of thinking. I really think about games as like a space for like playtesting different kinds of agency, different kinds of embodiment, different kinds of relationships to the natural world and also to ourselves and to each other. And this experimentation for me is pretty like fundamentally rooted in the body itself. I think in pretty much every game, you know, you're taking on, or players are asked to take on the body of like a non-human, typically non-playable character. So in some games you play as like Wildfire or the LA River itself, or you play as like a pack of 3 wolves, you know, living in this kind of desertified version of downtown LA. Other games you get to play as matter and antimatter, trying to find each other inside of a black hole. Third game you get to play as a bat or a flower. Again, another 2-player game, so you kind of choose your fighter, but also you're sort of roped in the same system together. And many of these kind of creatures or beings or entities that I kind of invite players to play as in my games, these are beings that really sit on the edge of human knowledge. I mean, I think, and that's kind of like for me, like the excitement and the fun and the joy and the messiness of making this kind of work is you pretty quickly like run up against the limits of what we know scientifically about black holes, for instance, or about nighttime pollinators, or about cycles of time as a forest may be experienced through the perspective of a wildfire. So yeah, it kind of starts inducing this body change, this state change that at times can feel quite psychedelic. Like as you're playing the games, like it kind of pulls you into this sort of expanded space. And for me, like as a game maker, I'm really interested in that notion of this kind of, yeah, like what Catherine Malibu, like one of my favorite philosophers, calls like the cognitive non-conscious. So she has this idea of like, okay, cognition is something that happens discretely in the brain, and sometimes it has like an inner voice, but a lot of the time it's just this constant system of sensory feedback. Like when you're going into the world, you kind of, you know, in a similar way to like collisions maybe, you go into the world and everything is like firing off of you all the time. And there's certain kind of behaviors or patterns you might pick up, ways you might like build up a sort of knowledge set or familiarity with that world through like not even realizing it. It just kind of happens, right? So I kind of think that, yeah, with games, like games that kind of ask you to embody these beings or these elements or these non-human characters that sit kind of just outside the limits of our understanding, something hopefully gives and like expands slightly in sort of occupying that perspective. And then maybe, you know, when we switch off the controller and we like go back to whatever it is we do when we're not playing games, that could be something that kind of sticks with us, like that feeling of, yeah, plasticity or openness. And yeah, I would also say that, you know, Catherine Malibu has been a really big kind of influence on my work. I think in addition to this notion of cognitive, non-conscious, you know, she also talks quite beautifully about this notion of plasticity. And given the theme, I know it's like apples and oranges slightly. I know it's same language, different things, sort of. But yeah, this notion of plasticity that she introduced in a book of the same name, published a few years ago in 2022. She kind of talks about, I mean, she's talking about the human brain, but she's really talking about this notion of transformation, that like transformation is a sort of two-way street. It's like the ability to kind of take form and give form at the same time. So plasticity is this expansive process. It's an opening up or an extension of consciousness before it hardens around a new identity. Like it's almost like a platformer game where it's sort of, you have this window where things get plastic and soft and mushy, and they can kind of reattach or be affected by other things in interesting ways. And then the second that consciousness hardens around its new identity, maybe it stays there for a bit, you know? And then maybe it gets like soft and gooey again. And I think that, yeah, for me, like games as this kind of interactive interface, this playable medium, become a space where as the player, you know, you are playing the world, but the world is also playing you back. And I think a lot about that relationship between player and environment, and if it could maybe be less of like a player versus environment, but like player as environment or environment as player. And that'll make more sense, I think, when I talk about Earth Engine, which is a game I'm currently working on. Yeah. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the projects. So, okay, The Alluvials is a simulation film and a 4-level single-player video game I made in 2023 to 2024. And it's really my own personal like love letter, I guess, to Los Angeles, which is messy and complicated, and yeah, you know, she's tough to love, but there's a lot of beauty there as well, in amongst the chaos. And I was really, really interested in LA's relationship to water, generally, and the sort of artificial scarcity of water that the city basically geoengineered itself into when it chose to channelize its river in the 1930s. Now this was after a really dangerous flood and like 100 people died, so the US Army Corps of Engineers was like called into the city, and before anyone could really say otherwise, yeah, they just erected this gigantic concrete tunnel all around the river. And that basically led us into the modern day, where the wildfire seasons is getting ever stronger. The drought is getting ever worse, because the water table, like that body of water that used to sit under the city of what's known as Los Angeles, and would kind of routinely flood the city. If you can even imagine it, it's hard to imagine, but LA was more of like a swamp, actually, like before this channelization. And it would routinely be able to kind of saturate itself from that water table. And therefore, you know, nothing would be as much of a tinderbox as it is these days. Of course, the topic of, yeah, mega fires in Los Angeles gets a lot more complicated than just that. And that's something that this game specifically looks at as it kind of invites players to play as wildfire. But yeah, the film itself, I think, is focusing really on sort of navigating the story of water scarcity in LA through a bunch of different protagonists. So it has like multiple narrators, like P22, the city's celebrity mountain lion, narrates part of it. Fire narrates part of it. The river itself narrates part of it. And it's the name of the alluvials, like titling and language is really important in my work. And the title of the alluvials comes from geology and the planetary sciences. So basically, an alluvial plain or an alluvial kind of imprint is the sort of geologic memory of a river. Once it dries up, it kind of leaves this almost like a fossil, like almost like a mark on the landscape, on the terrain it passes through. And it's kind of both here and not here. It's like a bit like a ghost, you know, a ghost of some kind of deep layered geologic time that maybe we don't really understand as humans. But it's also kind of a reference to this resource, you know, drying up, like the resource of water that LA used to have so bountifully. And it's understanding that rivers also, you know, they have a very different timeline than humans. Like it's kind of cyclical. And the Tongva and Gabrielino people of Los Angeles, like the indigenous stewards of the region, they knew that cycle really well, and they were kind of able to sort of live alongside the river. They would sort of move, you know, they would move their camps like and kind of move with the season. So yeah, they would sort of resettle a little further out when it was raining, or when it was like the flood season, and they would kind of move back, you know, to be closer to the river as it was drying up. So you know, being able to kind of occupy this relationship to the planet that is not operating on this like linear capitalist like death arrow, and instead kind of operating in this very sort of non-linear and cyclical, spiraling kind of way. I think this is something that the game and the film tries to get at. And it does this across different landscapes. I mean, the story, as I was doing all this research for the film, I spent a kind of 4 or 5 month period just having a self-instated residency at the LA Public Library. I would just go, show up every day after work and just kind of read through all of the primary sources I could possibly find. And there were hundreds, thousands of insanely rich primary documents around all of LA's water politics and how it was brokering deals with other states, even countries, to get its hands on more and more water. And also, I kind of pretty soon I realized that the story of LA's relationship to water is not just contained in Los Angeles itself. It kind of spreads pretty far and wide across the country, across the border into Mexico. So the film and the game, they go beyond just LA and the Malibu, Santa Monica region of the city. They kind of go also into the Hoover Dam. There's one chapter of the film, one level of the game where you get to play, and this was almost like a pre-game to Nightcrawlers. I would say in this level you get to play as either a Joshua Tree or a yucca moth, and it's a pollination simulator. So you basically choose do you want to pollinate or do you want to be pollinated? And there's some really funny kind of, weird dynamics of sort of entering into that relationship as a playable experience. I guess I'll just say that. So here's a little clip of the alluvials to give you a sense of how it feels, the film.
Some say that the history of Los Angeles is the history of its water. It's not easy to see in the desertified present, abandoned tower blocks caked with bone-dry deposits of spreading sand. Empty streets, prowled by the American gray wolf, brought back from the cusp of extinction by the chaotic fluctuations of a heating planet. But wait, pan out. Over to the revitalized zones along the river's meandering periphery, where Next LA is setting up shop, on the other side of Sepulveda. The water flows here in a constant cycle, pumped through state-of-the-art filtration systems on permanent rotation. It harkens back to a colonial fantasy, like that scene spied by the Spanish missionary Juan Crespi. Water so pure you can drink it straight from the source. A scene of a lush alluvial valley, hallucinated first in 1769 and later replicated by an AI-turned developer.
Okay, so that kind of gives you a little intro to the film. As you can tell, it does kind of jump backwards and forwards in time. It kind of does this quite typical parafictional or speculative fiction thing of citing really specific dates or events, but then kind of jumbling them up. So it kind of has this this chronology that's very sort of anti-chronological. And there's elements of it that are very much about the sort of corporate perspective on LA's relationship to water. There's some that are very much soaked in the kind of mystery or the open-endedness of kind of how the river sort of perceives or senses itself. and then all the ways that we're trying to sort of also sense it back through, like data visualization and archiving, like ecological sciences that are tracking, the pollution index of the river or its biodiversity, and ways that it kind of tries to sort of break outside of or break away from maybe the flattening effect of that way of understanding the river itself. So the game, I think, does that more. It was really trying to push back against the sort of linear narrative of film in general, even if the Alluvial's film was trying to, spice things up non-linearly. And I was thinking a lot around, okay, how do I take a film that's already kind of fully baked and then open it up again and sort of make instances or make certain characters or worlds in the game playable? How do I give them agency? How do I choose what kind of agency I want the player to have versus the landscape or the environment? Can I figure out a way where maybe these two beings, landscape or player and landscape, can kind of get compressed into one agent? And yeah, there's a bunch of different levels. As you go through it, you get to play, like I said, as a trio of wolves roaming downtown LA. You get to play as Joshua trees pollinating their cosmic partner, the yucca moth. You even get to embody the LA River itself in one level. And I would say that the kind of the most difficult level to play is the final level of the game. These are just some stills from, the wolf level. So the hardest, I would say the most challenging, and not in terms of mechanics, but just the experience, would be the wildfire level. And this game was made in 2024, so this was a year before California, or Los Angeles, had the most deadly and destructive series of fires in its history. That happened in January 2025. And yeah, the game in a way took on this pretty uncanny new dimension, kind of being faced with that recent history. And even in the game, there were basically two massive wildfires, one in Altadena, which is northeast side LA where I live, and then one in the Pacific Palisades in Malibu, in the Santa Monica mountain range, so on the west side of the city. And in this level of the game, you were literally playing as Wildfire in the Santa Monica mountains. And it's a tough one to kind of process, but I think that there is a lot going on in the film, or in the game, and I'll show a brief excerpts of how it kind of works mechanically. But you basically are moving through the landscape, igniting it, while also learning the history of the ways in which this land, this ecosystem, has basically been already sort of made so precarious through the history of satellites, colonization, settler colonialism. Even in the 1800s, the city of LA was pushing for everyone to, and when I say everyone, I mean white middle-class residents basically of Los Angeles, to go build their fancy summer homes or their little Malibu mansions, and they were giving massive tax write-offs to do that. And this part of the geography of the city has always been sort of beleaguered by and kind of fantasized with speculative real estate. And because of the amount of immense money to be made in thin air, they basically stopped practicing controlled burning in this region. And that is exactly how we kind of got into this mess that we were in last winter. Because, fire is an incredibly important resource for forest ecosystems. It clears the canopy, it kills off invasive species, it builds up a resilience that the ecosystem, the forest itself kind of has, It's a bit like going to the gym for trees, I guess. But yeah, so, so as you're playing this game, you are sort of igniting the world, but then the world is also kind of touching you back and speaking to you back, and you're not the fire, but you're also not the fire. It's kind of this strange form of embodiment. So yeah, I guess I'll just play a short excerpt, and then we'll jump into the next project.
Decommissioned planes are now being used to fight wildfires in California. Every summer and fall, fertilizer-based fire retardant dropped by planes coats the mountains in neon pink clouds. It contaminates the water, the landscape, and the air while the wildfire rages on. On loan from Canada, the $30 million CL-415 Super Scooper aircraft collects ocean water from the Pacific and dumps it onto the coastal flames. The salt water damages the ecosystem, and it is equally ineffective at fighting fire.
Okay, so that's the alluvials. That was 2024. And now we're gonna take a quick look at two kind of like twins, I would say, in my practice. Were a couple games that myself and like a small team of collaborators made in 2025. And these games are Nightcrawlers, the Bat and Flower Pollination Simulator, and also Small Void, which is the two-player black hole game. So basically, yeah, like as I sort of mentioned, you know, I just finished the alluvials, and I was really like getting super excited about like all these different forms of embodiment, this kind of relationality between the player and the world that games can kind of create by being this like necessarily sort of active and reactive system. And I figured like what better way to add more chaos to the mix than to just bring in more people. But I have like a soft spot for two-player games. There's not a whole lot of them out there. I feel like financially they don't really make as much money or make as much sense even as like single player or, you know, MOGs, like multiplayer games. So two-player games are not that common, but I think that there's something really interesting happens where this relationship between like the player and the landscape also becomes a bit of like a like a triangle. Like, you know, it's like a three-way thing, right? Where it's like there's player, world. So not only are you sort of negotiating between the landscape or the world and the narrative and everything, you're dealing with the weirdness of your own digital body, you're also kind of having to sort of work with someone else to sort of manage that together. So I think that this creates like a really interesting space of a kind of intimacy that I think can kind of push us into maybe like understanding other relationships between non-human agents, such as, yeah, nighttime pollinators, which also is something that a kind of, ecosystemic dynamic that we don't really know that much about. Like we know a lot about bees, and we know a lot about other daytime pollinators. We understand kind of how flowers evolve, like how they get such beautiful colors, how, you know, all to attract this pollinator, this fuzzy, cute guy. But then, yeah, I think when it comes to nighttime pollination, you know, it's an entirely different logic system. It's an entirely different ecological relationality. Flowers that bloom at nighttime have no business being blue or purple or red or whatever. They basically always look like a little anemic, like they're kind of on the cusp of dying. And they care much more about smell, and they care much more about shape. And that's because they're pollinators, the bats, whatever other animals. That's what those animals care about. Like bats obviously use echolocation to find their food, and the flower knows this. You know, evolutionarily, this is a language that these two beings speak to each other, and the flower learns what the bat likes and kind of adjusts itself accordingly. You know, so at nighttime flowers, you kind of get these huge kind of like trumpet shapes, like satellite shaped flowers that are really just there to act as this like, reflective kind of dome or mirror to kind of dilate the sound so that it gets back to the bat. So that's just some like little nerdy environmental fun facts. But apart from that, we don't really know that much. But we do know that bats are incredibly important. We know that they're even more important to ecosystemic survival than bees. Like they're what's called like a keystone species, so they prop up entire life worlds, and yet they're still kind of cloaked in mystery. So I think a lot of the time when I'm kind of divvying up like how I'm approaching a certain subject matter, it's kind of this point of mystery that I'm always really drawn to, and like find myself kind of like loving this ride of like how much of a kind of world or relationship can I build out knowing what I know, and then how much of it kind of gets to be expressed and experienced in this more ambient, non-verbal, non-vocalized way. And I think what's really important about both Small Void and Nightcrawlers is they are basically a game about cooperation, about collaboration, but they're also a game about the limits of language. Both of the games have zero language in them at all. There's not a single thing. There's no way to kind of communicate to the other player through words. So instead, in Nightcrawlers, you make music together. So that basically works as, bat or flower, you're kind of tunneling around the underground of this world. Or if you're bat, you're kind of zooming around the top. Because it's set inside of the Grand Palais in Paris, which is, where this game was premiered. It was like a collaboration with Pompidou. And it's kind of fun because the game itself, the game world mirrors the world of where the game was being shown. The way that the kind of music-making minigame functions is the players kind of have to zoom around the landscape and collect these little charms, which are basically music tokens. And then it's kind of like you get to make a score with those charms you collect, and whoever collects them first gets to sort of be the music master, and then whoever, was slow that time has to kind of sing it back to them. So it's also a game because we assume with pollination, for instance, there's the pollinated and there's the pollinator. But I was really interested in this game of can I flip that hierarchy to make things a little switchy, or maybe the flower in some way gets to pollinate the bat. It doesn't make sense, ecologically, but it's kind of that playing with agency in that way that can feel really fluid was something that I was super interested in developing for this game. So here's just a really beautiful image that kind of showcases the underground tendrils almost of the flower. And we'll get to kind of watch a bit of gameplay as well. This is just an installation. So you get to see kind of how it feels to be a bat and how it feels to be a flower. Yeah. So that's the game kind of in a nutshell. I think an interesting challenge, because I mentioned earlier, I typically, the way I make games is I typically like to assemble a small cohort of maybe 3 to 4 people to work with. And in that way, getting to kind of work with both developers, but also musicians and graphic designers to kind of work on building this world out together. This is something we can maybe talk about, in the Q&A around the workflow of everything. But one really beautiful thing about this project was getting to work with this musician, Nicholas Snyder, who maybe some of you have watched Scavenger's Reign. It's this amazing animated series, peak worlding, I would say. One of my students recommended it to me, and changed my life. Not to be dramatic or anything, but yeah, it's insanely beautiful. Yeah, sci-fi narrative about basically humans crash landing on a planet that's trying to kill them. But the kind of like thickness of the lore around the creatures, the ecosystem, everything feels so psychedelic and crazy. Like it's so non-human, the narrative focus. And anyways, the guy who did the score for Scavenger's Reign, which is an insanely beautiful score, is, the guy who did the score for Nightcrawlers. So I think it's really fun to kind of be, again, thinking about sound in 3D. It's like a totally different experience than like scoring a film, like a sort of linear track. It's a lot harder. You have to kind of split the stems up and figure out like spatial sound. But I think in that way, like it can be, and like it was Nicholas's like first time scoring for a game, so like we learned a lot together, and yeah, I think it kind of gives this vibe to the work that feels quite melancholic. I mean, I guess maybe it's enhanced by the fact that you can only play at nighttime. Like every now and again, the sun will rise, and it's kind of a randomizer timer. So some days some nights that feel infinitely long, and some nights that feel super short. But yeah, you obviously can't play when the sun's up, so you just gotta like wait and chill. So in that way, like it's kind of fun too, because the game world has its own sort of logic, and yeah, you as the player kind of are a bit below maybe the hierarchy of the world sort of playing itself. Okay, cool. So Small Void is another one of the games I made in 2025. It's really like I think of these two games as like little siblings, like, and I think because they are both two-player, they're both cooperative. Nightcrawlers is asymmetrical because it's like you're playing as two different creatures, but Small Void you're playing as basically the same thing, basically matter and antimatter. And this was a game that I developed at CERN, which is the European Center for Nuclear Research in Switzerland. And I was there for a couple months, and I knew I wanted to make a video game about black holes. I knew I wanted to just basically spend as much time as I possibly could talking to all of CERN's like world-leading experts in black holes, and basically figuring out some really interesting ways that maybe we think of how sound moves inside of black holes, if the image could persist inside of black holes, what it might look like, what happens when a black hole dies, like, when it collapses in on itself, where does all the stuff inside of it go? Like all these questions that kind of were, for me, like so fascinating as like a, general way to sort of spend my days thinking about black holes, but also like ways in which maybe I could kind of bring some of these really complex ideas around physics, like and cosmology, into a game environment, a playable experience. So basically what I ended up with this project is, essentially I like to think of it as like a dating simulator. So in a way it's sort of similar to Nightcrawlers, but in Small Void you really are embodying matter and antimatter, which split apart on the edge of the black hole, and one of them kind of tumbles into the black hole, and the other one is sort of sent back out into space. This is like based on it's like Hawking's radiation paradox. It's like an idea in physics to kind of explain why, if black holes are so big, how do they eventually die, and like where does all the stuff inside of them go? So it's kind of based on this like theory that has a lot of stock in like the theoretical physics community. So yeah, you're playing as matter and antimatter. One of you falls in, one doesn't. And then basically the whole game, the premise of the game is that you're trying to find your other half. And they could be in totally different dimensions from you. You have really no way of knowing, because when you're playing, you only see your screen, and the other screen of the other player is invisible to you. Like you can't see it. So there's certain clues that the landscape kind of gives you. Some of them are sonic. Again, I worked with an amazing musician on this, Magda Drode, based in Switzerland. Some of them are sonic, so maybe if both players are in the volcano level, then the sound will be a little different. It might be busier, there might be echoes of their footsteps. There's also these kinds of giants on the horizon, as you can see here. And if the other player is also in this world, the giants start moving. If they're not in this world, they don't move. So yeah, this is kind of thinking about how do you communicate through sound, through anything like nonverbal, like through haptics. Like haptic feedback is a really big component of this game as well. The second level, which are connected through these like this like wormhole system. The second level is Dark Forest, and in this level, you know, image is basically useless, as is theorized to also be the case inside of black holes. There's like no way you can orient yourself using the visual. So you kind of have to think about like gravitational waves and sound, and maybe how sound travels through a black hole. If it collides with another being and ricochets off of that being and then hits you, it might sound a little different, or it might feel different, you know? So yeah, in this level, basically the only mechanic is a vibrating controller, and the controller itself, your controller becomes this kind of compass that sort of leads you towards the other player. So the closer you are to each other, the more intensely and crazy the controller vibrates. If you go too far away, it totally dies out. And then if you're kind of in the middle, it'll start vibrating in a specific section of the controller, like almost like a literal compass, like if it's to kind of tell you which direction the other player's in. So a lot of this is like mechanics that are very much cognitive non-conscious, you know, like it's kind of this idea of like, like creating a system that's very much based on sensory knowledge, like sensory understanding, sensory mystery as well, and kind of trying to produce this environment, you know, that does involve quite a bit of guesswork on the end of the player. Yeah, I'll just show a quick excerpt of this video. Obviously, you can see both screens here, which isn't the case in real life, but you know, for entertainment purposes only. Okay, so that kind of gives you a little hint of how the game flow works, and yeah, the kind of the ultimate goal of the game is to find your other half and to do this thing called annihilation, which is as dramatic as it sounds. Essentially, this is what happens when matter and antimatter collide. They kind of explode. This is how it's theorized that black holes, like what happens when black holes die, is they actually also they explode essentially and radiate all of their packaged information. So whatever's inside of a black hole gets like spread and like radiated across the universe. And that's actually the main theory right now for thinking about how the universe expanded in its very early days, like as intensely as it did. Like a lot of physicists and black hole researchers think that it's because there was like 1 billion tiny, tiny black holes that all kind of exploded at the same time. So in a way, like you are trying to find each other and you are annihilating, but what I was really interested in is this idea of like cosmological evolutionary theory, which basically says that, in order for the universe to constantly evolve, like black holes and matter and antimatter, like life itself kind of has to constantly be in this state of like explosion and like radiance. So I thought that was kind of like a really beautiful concept in physics, and again, sort of speaks to this universe time, like versus the time of the individual player or the time of the experience of playing the game. It's also kind of thinking about how these relationships scale and stack up, and also just kind of reveling in the mystery of some of it too. Like it was based on kind of hard, quote unquote, hard physics as much as I could, but then there's a lot that's just guesswork. But luckily I did meet a physicist, this Italian guy who's like super, super into video games, so we really like jammed it out there, and like a lot of the mechanics that came into the game was like specifically from him. So yeah. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so what I'm gonna do is I think I wanna wrap up with Earth Engine, because one of my collaborators is actually in the audience. It's not gonna embarrass you, but you know who you are. And yeah, Earth Engine is a a game that I've been working on with, again, like a kind of small team, myself, Freddie Sanders on development, Paige Emery, a friend from LA on music, and this really amazing tattoo artist that I just found on Instagram, and I was like, I love your work, do you want to design graphics for my game? And he was like, sure. So sometimes, you know, not above a cold call, like fangirling and finding someone who's, you know, a lot of people like, yeah, maybe this is something we can talk about too in terms of like production processes, but a lot of people kind of like, even if they don't have experience, like it's really fun to bring them in, and I feel like every time I make a work, like I learn a lot about, you know, different like sound design for games, for instance. That was like a brand new kind of thing that I was sort of grappling with last year. And then yeah, just the kind of like knowledge sets that like having a collaborative team, everyone kind of brings their own sort of specialization. And for me, this is really cool because it always ends up pushing the work into like a place that feels very sort of different in some ways than how I imagined it would be in the beginning. But that feels like it really, you know, embraces that kind of multiplicity of players, of people kind of working on this thing, of nurturing this being. So yeah, so this is Earth Engine. Earth Engine is really like this game concept that I've been super interested in, like especially since my work has sort of moved in this direction where I'm focusing a lot on climate simulators, on like predictive technologies, like climate models, kind of like remote sensing technologies, like gigantic radio telescope systems that are being used to like hopefully sense other life, or at least beyond kind of the limits of what we can see currently in the cosmos. And also like GPS and satellite technologies that are sort of turning their lenses on our planet and trying to sort of sense us in increasingly higher resolution. And this game, like sort of in the spirit of clipping, in the spirit of glitching, in the spirit of like degradation, of kind of messing with the agency of the player and sort of giving the agency back to the world or back to the planet. Earth Engine is really like a game that sort of is trying to kind of squeeze all of these concepts together into an experience where the planet Earth gets to actually sort of play itself. And how it does this is it uses real-time climate data. So when you log on to play the game, it kind of loads, you know, your geolocation, and it loads you into the world and the weather system in whatever, you know, of the 9 levels you end up in first. It's randomized. Will kind of replicate the weather outside. And that's technology that's being used in like the next Grand Theft Auto, in the next hopefully Red Dead, fingers crossed. It's being used in a bunch of different game systems, and it's just, again, this kind of fantasy of like more immersive gaming, like better immersion equals like better game, basically. But in this game, the emotional state of the Earth Engine is kind of reacting to the weather. So basically when you get loaded in, it's like, if it's raining, it's kind of naturally going to be a little more, the Earth Engine character who appears in the game as a sort of little like Tamagotchi-esque sprite on the left-hand side of the UI, he's going to be more mad at you. And then also, if it's like sunny, he's like vibing, he's like loving life, you know, it's like, he's a little more chill. But then, yeah, the way that you move through the world, if you move too quickly, that also kind of upsets the Earth Engine, and it will start literally like tearing apart the landscape in front of you. It will kind of have this like tantrum, basically. And it will also, yeah, like if you kind of slow down and zoom in, there's like a sort of mini photo sim component to the game where you can kind of zoom in and like stare at like a tree leaf or something. And it really likes that, you know, it really likes when you sort of basically like don't try to speed run your way through the system. And it kind of rewards that, you know, with the weather changing, with its emotional state changing. So this is the Earth Engine. Yeah, and he kind of has this very sort of pixel art, like very flat, like 8-bit aesthetic that for me and the developer Freddie, like we were really interested in the kind of the contrast, I guess, between working with, you know, 3D landscapes that are being photo scanned in, or sometimes even entire cities that we are importing in, because real-scale digital double of the planet already exists, and its name is Cesium, among many others. And this is like a software plugin for Unreal where you could basically import entire terrain maps like into your game level and build out basically like an entire city instantaneously. Now, the graphics aren't amazing. They're very, when you start looking at them, it feels very sort of like, you know, early Google Maps, where like everything is just like flat and like kind of blocky and bad looking. But we were also quite interested in that and like playing around with the sort of blockiness and the kind of like low poly aesthetic as well. And yeah, we wanted to have game worlds that felt simultaneously very sort of like high definition, having the Earth engine be this like flat little 8-bit guy just buzzing around on the screen, making your life very difficult, kind of like playing you back, even if you try to sort of figure out what it is you're supposed to be doing in this world. But then, yeah, just kind of having all these different aesthetics, like the more, yeah, like 3D scan thing versus like these kind of photoreal, like asset packs essentially. And yeah, I am going to play an excerpt just so you can get a sense for how the game works, and then we can wrap it up and move to Q&A. Cool. That's it.
Oh, that was pretty cool. No, amazing work. Like, super fascinating. I think there's like so much things that we could be talking about in your presentation. I think one thing that is very fascinating in Alice's work is very much about the level of deep understanding. Not on, you know, it's a kind of attunement between technicalities, understanding of the subjects, the sort of like relationship that you're trying to build and everything between, and sort of the gameplay itself and the relationship to the player. You know, it's so rich and dense. And there's so many interesting as well with regard to clipping and things like that. I mean, I remember the early days of like Red Dead Redemption when people would clip through the invisible wall, and then you would see the builds of early builds of you know, terrains and things like that. That's like, there's tons of YouTube videos actually of people doing that. It's really fascinating. There's kind of a cult around this, discovering these hidden islands. One thing about plasticity, I thought actually the way you framed it was very much, you know, with regard to the sort of like brief that we have working at the moment, is actually very relevant simply because of I think the idea of rewiring your brain, this is a little bit like what we're trying to do here, which is like rewiring our relationship and our understanding with certain type of material, including like plastic in this particular case. And I think this is very much what we're trying to do here for this particular brief, to try to look at it from a way where, that we, maybe need to rewire our consciousness around it in order to understand something different and something that weird that could emerge from it. Anyway, I have a couple of questions, but I'm gonna ask them if nobody asks questions, but I'm sure other people have questions.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really new to see ecological, new way of seeing ecology in games. And I'm really curious about your approach with non-human characters. As if we are giving voice or agency to a non-human or an animal, isn't it a bit filtered through human perspective? And how do you navigate that tension in your practice?
Yeah, I feel like it's such a good question. And I was going round the bend, as a filmmaker, trying to sort of get away from that tendency to give voice to, these beings that kind of, they have their own language or communication system a lot of the time, but it obviously is so different relationally to ours. And thinking about the kind of two-way plasticity again. I don't know why I'm shouting out Malibu so much in this song, but here we go. Love her. Thinking about ways in which maybe there can be a contact point or a touch point between these two worlds while also acknowledging the limits of our own understanding. For me, the answer to that was making games and moving away from these kind of filmic narratives that are trying as hard as they can to sort of create this disturbance or this disassociation of not sketching out a linear story and giving a top-down play-by-play of how it goes. But games I think more, or at least personally for me, more than a film that is really vibey and doesn't use language and maybe kind of creates these openings for imagination. I think what's really cool about games is the agental nature of them. So, a film can kind of induce that state where maybe the plasticity thing is happening and your sense of self is blending with the sense of many other selves, where the non-human or the more than human can kind of be given this protagonist status, but it still is it's a piece of, it's a filmic thing that has closed edges. There's a beginning, there's an end. It's a file that is kind of inert, it's not moving. Whereas games, for me, the kind of animacy of the Infinite Engine, the way that it, the story, maybe you give it a sort of broad framework, but it's really about the relationality of the player and how they want to go through that process of becoming temporarily, merging with fire or temporarily merging with bat, however they kind of want to do that, and the kind of awkwardness of stumbling through that. As a kid and even now, the kind of I really love the first 5 minutes of playing a game, where you just wake up and you're who am I, and what's going on, and what am I trying to do here, and how do I move, what's my name, that awkwardness before the player and the character seal and become one is a kind of state that I always try to kind of keep as long as possible in the game, in the games I make, because I think it's doing what you're saying around how do you kind of give voice to those that have very different communication systems than us, or maybe see the world differently than us. Isn't it always filtered through the lens of human perception? And yes, that's true. But I think being in this blobby state where everything is disorienting and you're sort of being reoriented, and it takes forever to kind of touch the ground and lock into your new self, that gets the closest to what you're asking for and what I'm trying to do. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool.
Hello. Hi. It was really interesting to see all of the aspects of fantastical elements that you put in, and especially non-human points of view. I've grown up playing a lot of RPG and strategy games. I was wondering, and you also mentioned how there's a lot of influence of physics and actual embedded into physics element into it. So when you design games, where do you draw a line between physics and fantastical elements, and then how would each of them, like, influence each other and the experience of the game itself?
Yeah, real. Okay. Let's see. Well, I don't want to repeat myself, but I feel like Small Void is like maybe a good example of this because it's so obviously coming out of physics, and specifically like quantum physics. So yeah, like when I was at CERN, like I was meeting up mostly with black hole researchers, but a lot of them are also like big into quantum, especially at the scale of a tiny black hole, which is like the kind that I thought was the most interesting. That's sort of when these like quantum states get induced. So in that game, yeah, there's like components like that feel like they're pulling really heavily from like the best we know of like the physics of black holes and like how these like huge systems kind of operate. So like for instance, there's the element with like the giants in the background. That was actually Marco, the Italian physicist's idea, because he's like a specialist and like one of the world's like leading experts in like studying the effect of gravitational waves inside of black holes. So he kind of introduced me to this. He was like, oh, wouldn't it be really cool if like, because like basically there's this idea that like if once you cross the event horizon and go into the black hole, time and space, basically you're being like stretched in such a crazy way that the further away, like say you and someone else fell in, the further away from the person you are, the more iterations of past and future versions of that person would appear. So the further away they are, there's like a crowd of like 100, 1,000 copies, I don't know, of the other person. And the closer you get to each other, the more they become real time. The more they become like actually you. So yeah, or actually them, I mean, but also you, I guess. So yeah, like in the game we were like interested in playing around with that idea of like these giants, like the further away they are from you, the more slowed down their imitations of the other player's movements. So that was kind of just like, in terms of like physics, like the physics engine of the game, like, I mean, it was really just a sort of like delay effect, you know, that's changing based on proximity of the players, like to each other. And also like conceptually, like, I don't know, for me it felt quite, this is where maybe the dating simulator component comes in. It's like, you know, when you're like, don't know someone that well, there's like many, many, many versions of that person that are all kind of real in a way, but they're also all kind of fantasy. And then like the closer you guys get, like the more, I don't know, them as like a whole persona like emerges and like becomes real. And like, yeah, so like in a way, like it is physics, it is like game logic, but it's also like love. So I feel like I try to sort of do, yeah, there's like a lot of like big feeling in my games and like ways of making things that feel like technically robust and like physically robust or like heavy on the science, you know? But then, like, I mean, one of the films I didn't get to show, Staring at the Sun, you know, one of the main narrators is a supercomputer that is based on like a real life supercomputer that, you know, is a script that was basically like I wrote after interviewing a bunch of people working with the supercomputer to like render climate simulations. But in the film, Derecho is the name of the supercomputer. It like has a perfect memory and can calculate like every single possible outcome of the future of our planet, but it actually is just obsessed with clouds and it wants to be a poet. You know, like, and it loves clouds because clouds like mess with every climate model ever. Like clouds are these like model anarchists that like destroy our understanding of like how the climate works. So it's kind of like, how can I pull the physics and like the hard science, implement that into the game engine in an interesting space? Like that film works a lot with sky domes, you know, this kind of and the billboarding of like the flat kind of two-dimensional backdrop. And there's moments where the camera kind of breaks through that and like really messes it up. Like as Derecho is like yapping about clouds, you know? So like, yeah, there's kind of like, how do you triangulate the physics or like the science element, the physics and like the game element, the technical aspect of creating this thing, and then like the love or like the poetry. And yeah, the ratios change, but there's always those three things in there, I guess. Yeah.
Any other question?
Hello. I just wanted to ask you a question. It's probably a very personal question, that it's about it seems to me that you've managed to create a whole system of invitations.
Of what?
Invitations, inviting people to do something.
Yeah.
But they don't know what they're going to do, but they're invited to do
Yeah.
something. For you personally, conceptually, what's a good invitation looks like?
Personally, I mean, I like being dropped into something and not being given any kind of tutorial or like instruction manual and just being left to like flail around until I find it. Yeah, this is like a massive like side swoop into like not sponsored content. But one of my favorite writers, Aubrey Annabelle, they wrote Playing with Feelings, which is this really beautiful game on, or this really beautiful book on game studies and affect theory. And they have a whole chapter dedicated to failure. And they are really interested in the ways in which games not only can deal with like personal failure, and maybe too much of the focus on failure in games is about the personal, about like the individual, like, you know, not beating like the high score and feeling like garbage or whatever, or the frustration of like losing against this, like a nebulous kind of system. But they are like really interested in games that kind of teach us about collective failure or like systemic failure. So instead of like the individual character being like versus the world or versus like the system of the game, it's actually like the world is going to fall apart or fall, like the model is going to collapse like no matter what you do, you know? But it's actually about understanding, okay, this thing is like a house of cards, it is collapsible, like whatever you want to call it, like water scarcity, capitalism, I don't know, like there's so many different systems that are broken. And what games can do, and I think the kind of games I like to play, and like the kind of games that feel like really seductive for me and like draw me in, are these games that handle failure as this like systems, like or like systemic kind of topic. So games that kind of invite, like it's almost like a forest, like clearing of like a forest, or like reaching a clearing in a forest, and it's kind of just this like breath of air. Like there's like this breath of space that feels like, okay, you know, capitalism was a flop. What next? Like, what should we try next? Like, what should we play next? Like, yeah. So I think games that kind of don't, like, I don't like games where the designer has tried to sort of exert too much control over the player's behavior, or is like spoon feeding them the lore, or it's just like a glorified cutscene. I mean, I love Death Stranding, but like that game is like 3/4 cutscenes, you know. And I'm like, cool. Like, but this is like a graphic novel. I mean, okay, that was a massive diss. I don't mean I don't mean that. There's like insanely good mechanics in that game too. But like I guess what I'm trying to say is like for me the cool thing, like the games that I get really excited about are the games that introduce you into this like system that's kind of falling apart, that's like kind of janky, like it's kind of busted. And like there's a moment where it does collapse, and then but like it kind of, yeah, like you don't really know how or when. You know that you have an agency in it, but you don't know exactly what that is. So they kind of invite this like deeper exploration and like deeper merge between the player and the world. And then ultimately at the end of the day, they open up a space that wasn't there before to think about like what else, you know? So yeah.
You had another question at the back. Like how Death Stranding. Do you know Richard Wrong?
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was super interesting. I'm really interested in your reading of clippings as like kind of moments of failure to like infrastructures and systems. I'm wondering if you have observed any other instances of rupture in games that function in the same way as clippings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, I mean, the notion of like lag, right? Or like when frame rates skip, stuff that feels annoying and like a technological shortcoming. But I think also something that, especially with lag, like something that just kind of forces you to like slow down. And this also like there's something kind of nice about it, like when the frame rate does catch up, and there's just been this whole like moment of gameplay that's just eclipsed, like it's like evacuated, you know, it's like left the building, and you don't really know exactly what was going on in that moment, but the kind of like big mystery of it is like fun for me. What else? I mean, I was recently playing Second Life again, just because I was curious to see like what was going on over there, and I guess it is kind of like an example of clipping, but what's really interesting about that game is like Linden Labs. I mean, it's one of the first like massive multiplayer online games, and the developer Linden Labs intentionally never moved to like a bigger game engine. Like they kind of built their own engine, so it's like really, really glitchy, really laggy, really buggy. When you like load into a world, it takes like your clothes like a minute longer than it takes you. So it's just kind of funny when you go to like, I don't know, the club, right? You like rock up to the Second Life club and there's like a bunch of like torsos and like people running around naked, and it's supposed to be this like really, you know, like whatever, like party, like suave, like fun, like swanky environment, and then it's just like a bunch of, people just running around with no clothes on. Maybe that's like a little more specific of an example than you want, but it is just fresh on my mind. And like, I think what's really interesting about Second Life and like the kind of fans it has now is that these are people who really don't care about like high fidelity graphics and like frame rate efficiency, and like they actually are craving actually a space that feels kind of ruined and like abandoned and like defunct in some way, because they can kind of exist like in the cracks of this like crumbling, like obsolete virtual world. So I'm really drawn towards like, that idea, which I think comes a lot from like, I don't know, like queer theory or like queer archive, like this notion of like the archive being, and like the kind of, the space that like other people have kind of turned away from or abandoned, like then being this place where you can kind of like create new community and like kind of take up space and like have this sort of archive or index of like community history. I don't know. Like, when I was on Second Life, I was noticing a lot more of that kind of stuff happening. Like, I guess it had been a few years since I'd been logged on. I was wondering if that was like tied to some of like the political situation in the States and like wanting like virtual worlds, like wanting this like space that's like safe and like a place that you can kind of build like, build out with your crew.
Talking about clipping, do you look into speed running?
Yes.
Strategies around it.
I mean, I watched like the YouTuber kind of, you know.
Because they actively use all the sort of lag, clipping in order to break the game for their speedrunning.
Yeah. And there's like the anti-movement too, which is like slow running. Which is like, can you take longer to beat this? Like even longer?
I guess so. Can I just ask one question? I was just wondering, sorry. I was just wondering in terms of like, it's not a big question, it's very practical. I was wondering, what does the sort of like game engine does to your thinking in terms of constraints and affordances of the game? It's just like, how does it influence the way you come up with your like ideas and concept for a game and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, my process, like, honestly, since I moved to LA, maybe it's because everything in LA is a simulation or feels like a simulation, but that's like really when it kind of popped off for me. But paradoxically, like being in LA, like I also need to like go climb a mountain like a few days a week, just like but then if I'm like having a really intense like working session in Unreal, like where I'm building out an environment, and then I go like to the national forest. I'm like, wow, that like ray tracing looks really good. Like, oh, that like 8K rock texture is amazing. Like, so I start kind of like looking at the landscape and like thinking about like, oh, like how can I imitate that like effect in Unreal? So I feel like my brain like breaks sometimes, like, or like it kind of moves. It like transplants like on like the virtual onto the real and the real into the virtual. Which I don't hate. Like I actually kind of, it feels like I'm going insane, but it's also like feels like it kind of, and like I do have to go out to the world and like, just like have these like touch grass kind of interactions. And then I go back into the Unreal cave and I'm like, let's go, and like in a way like, like I think the feedback loop between the work that I make and the kind of where I get my inspiration from is very much like the natural world and like the landscape of Los Angeles. And I don't think that like, I mean, typically when I'm starting to think about a game concept, like I don't really start with the engine. Like I start more like broad brush concepts, and sometimes it's like character design or level design. And yeah, like, I mean, having a collaborator too, that's like handling a lot of the heavy lifting on the dev side. Like it's also kind of like a conversation of like, okay, where, like what's possible, you know, given this concept of like matter and antimatter like exploding inside of a black hole. Like like, in terms of like game physics, like what effects can we achieve with, you know, like maybe twisting some asset packs or changing some elements of like textures or just doing something maybe like the wrong way, but in order to like create an effect, you know? So I think, yeah, like largely the kind of ideation always starts like outside of the engine.
Right.
Usually in the middle of nowhere.
Touching grass.
Up in the mountain.
Clipping in real life.
Exactly, real life clipping.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was amazing. Thank you for sticking around. And I'm gonna cure my migraine. Yeah, that was cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, totally.
Do you know, because you mentioned Paige Emery,